Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for our Grassroots Advocacy webinar being hosted by the Cancer Policy Institute at the Cancer Support Community. My name is Rob Goldsmith, and I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director here at CSC. We're so happy that you could join us today for our first webinar of 2016. Tonight's webinar will focus on clinical trials advocacy. For those that are not familiar with our organization, this slide shows our mission statement. The Cancer Support Community is an international patient advocacy nonprofit dedicated to ensuring that all people impacted by cancer are empowered by knowledge, strengthened by action, and sustained by community. This slide gives a brief overview of the work that we do at CSC. Our organization includes over 170 locations across the country. These affiliates provide direct service delivery, including social and emotional support, available free of charge to millions around the country impacted by cancer. We also have an extensive research arm with our Research and Training Institute in Philadelphia. Finally, there is our advocacy work being done through the Cancer Policy Institute. This includes our Grassroots Network and the webinar you are participating in today. This slide is just a brief bio covering my background. I was pleased to join the Cancer Support Community in February of 2015. In my previous role, I served on the staff of former Congressman Bruce Braley as a senior legislative assistant, where I handled his committee portfolio on the Energy and Commerce Committee. So before I introduce our speakers for this evening, I'd like to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. All participants are invited to ask questions at any point during the presentation. If you have a question for our speakers, please type your question in the Q&A field at the bottom right of your screen, and we will answer as many of your questions as possible at the very end of the webinar. Secondly, we are going to be conducting a poll question right now for everybody that's participating that we would like to invite everyone to participate in. And we're going to put the question up right now. And the question is, do you think that patients get placebos on clinical trials? So if you'd like to participate, please answer the question either yes or no right now, and we'll announce the results of the poll a little bit later in the program. It's now my privilege to introduce our speakers for tonight's webinar. First off, our keynote speaker for tonight is Mary Jackson Scroggins. Mary is a 19-year ovarian cancer survivor and health activist. She is a writer, producer, and founding partner of Pinkie Hugs, LLC, a writing and film production firm that specializes in social justice-focused documentaries. Mary is also a co-founder of In My Sister's Care, an organization focused on improving cancer awareness and care for medically underserved women. We are very excited to have Mary joining us this evening to share her expertise on clinical trials with us. However, before we turn things over to Mary, I would like to introduce Gwen Darien. Gwen is the Executive Vice President of Programs and Services here at CSC, where she oversees research, programs, education, and patient and family services. Prior to joining CSC, Gwen was a director of the Pathways Project, an organization that puts people at the center of healthcare research and delivery. Gwen also served as the executive director of the Samuel Waxman Cancer Research Foundation, where she developed collaborations across all segments of the cancer community. Gwen is an expert on understanding clinical trials and clinical trials advocacy, and we are very much looking forward to her presentation. So Gwen, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you.
Great. Thank you, Rob. And oh, good. And now I have control of the slides. And thank you, everybody, for joining. I'm very much looking forward to talking to you about this. Okay, so what do I do? Oh, there we go. We're going to try not to worry about my technical inabilities. But looking forward to talking to you about clinical trials, a little bit of an overview about clinical trials, and then also about clinical trials advocacy. And we're going to start, the presentation overview will start with understanding clinical trials. What are clinical trials? And then we'll go into, and Mary's going to talk a lot about what is clinical trials advocacy. And there's a very, very broad range of being able to be involved in advocacy. And we're going to give you some an overview and then also some real-world examples. We're going to tell you about ways to become involved. We're going to give you available resources, and then we're going to show you how you can take action. So I think before deciding and even thinking about clinical trials advocacy or any kind of patient advocacy, we have to understand clinical trials and the research enterprise and what role clinical trials play in the research enterprise and what role advocates and participants play in that. So clinical trials, what is a clinical trial? I think there have been a lot of conversations around this. There are some misconceptions. There are some overestimations of what clinical trials do, but they're very, very complex, and they've evolved a lot, and there are multiple different kinds of clinical trials. So there are research studies that compare the most effective known treatments for a specific type or stage of cancer with a new approach. This can be, most people when they think about clinical trials think about treatment trials or drug trials. But this can also be, we can also do clinical trials looking at prevention or secondary prevention if you've already had a trial, looking at quality of life, looking at exercise, looking at psychosocial issues. So there's a whole range of clinical trials. There are trials that involve new approaches to surgery and radiation therapy. There are trials for every type of cancer, and this is another area where we'll look at what some of the misconceptions are. While many trials focus on late-stage disease, there also are trials to prevent cancer, improve early diagnosis, stop the cancer from coming back, and reduce, as I said before, reduce side effects or improve quality of life. And I think many people know in the community, in the larger community, that a great example of this is what happened in the change of standard of care for women who are diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. And there was a significant critical trial that showed that women who were diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer their outcomes were just the same if they had very radical surgery or if they had a lumpectomy. But prior to doing that trial, where these two arms, is what we call the two parts of the trial, were compared, nobody knew that. And every woman diagnosed with breast cancer got extremely radical, very disfiguring surgery. And so this is one of the great successes of clinical trials and how clinical trials really impacted practice. It's also a great example of how the medical community came together with thousands of altruistic volunteers to participate in learning about what would help the women themselves as well as people that came after them. So clinical trials, just to give you a little sense of what they are, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, they are the engine that drives progress in cancer treatment. And for those of us who are diagnosed with cancer, and those of us who have loved ones who are diagnosed with cancer, every drug, every treatment, everything that we've been given, if we didn't receive it within a clinical trial, we were given because it went through a clinical trial with volunteers who showed the effectiveness of that treatment. So it is the only way to find out if a new drug or treatment is better than the existing standard of care. So all of the new discoveries that we see out there all came through clinical trials. And in many instances, it's the only way for a patient to get a new or experimental approach before it's approved for general use. And I know many people have probably listened to, seen a lot of things in the news about new immunotherapy treatment for a lot of cancers like melanoma and lung cancer. And much of that, in the early days, that was the only way to get those drugs. And in some of the other diseases, it still is. It's also a chance to benefit from a new therapy or approach, and I think that this is a short bullet point, but I think it is critical to point out that clinical trials are done because people do not know the difference whether the new treatment is going to be better than the old treatment. If they knew the new treatment was going to be better, it wouldn't be ethical to do a clinical trial. They have there is data that shows that that the hypotheses are built on data, but it is still something where we test the unknown against the known. It is also something, if you're in a clinical trial, and we'll talk about this more later, where the comparison, if you're comparing to current treatment, is the best available treatment for your disease. It is also an incredible opportunity to help future cancer patients and contribute to research. And most of us do everything in our lives for multiple reasons. We don't do it for just one reason. People, it's the same thing with clinical trials. People participate, they hope to help themselves, they hope to help their immediate community, and they hope to help future cancer patients in society. And it's a way to be involved in the front lines of research to advance cancer care. And I think there are multiple ways, clearly, to be involved in the front lines of research. And Mary will talk about the advocacy piece, and then there's also the piece as a participant in a clinical trial to be really on the front lines of really very exciting science. So, do we have a poll?
Can you share the? We're checking at the moment to see what the results of our poll are.
Okay. So I think one of the things that we talked about and that we talk about a lot are some of the barriers to participation in clinical trials. Is the notion of myths versus reality, and there are many myths that are out there. And one of the biggest myths is about myths and also concerns is about placebos and randomization. So there is, when we asked through our Cancer Experience Registry whether women with metastatic breast cancer would participate in a clinical trial, a majority of them said no because they were afraid of getting placebo. You do not get placebos in cancer clinical trials. You get the standard of care, and the only time you ever get a placebo is if there is no standard of care. So that is a myth that is carried over, I think, from a lot of media, and also thinking about clinical trials in other disease states. It's not the same as a clinical trial for hay fever medicine. And so now we have the results.
The results are, again, the question was, do patients get placebos on clinical trials? 57% of you said yes, and 43% of you said no.
So I hope that by the end of this presentation, you will understand that that myth will be addressed for you, and you will understand the reality is that you do not get a placebo, and in fact, you often get better care because you are a part of a care team that is that monitors you very closely. One of the concerns, which isn't really a myth, but one of the concerns that a lot of people have about participating in clinical trials is that the computer chooses your treatment versus your healthcare professional. And that is true when they're randomized clinical trials. And there are double-blind trials. The doctor doesn't know what you're getting, your healthcare professional doesn't know what you're getting, and you don't know what you're getting. But there are safeguards that are built in. And if a trial the new drug is doing very, very well, they stop the trial and they often allow people to cross over into the experimental arm. So there are always safeguards that are part of these trials, and part of this is you'll learn about in the informed consent part of the webinar that we will talk about later. Patient protections and research, which again we will go into at much greater length. A lot of people fear being a guinea pig, and this has, and it is not. You are not. You are not going to be a guinea pig if you are in a clinical trial. Yes, it's a research experiment, but no, you're not treated as a guinea pig. There is a tremendous amount of science and a tremendous amount of work that's done prior to putting people on clinical trials. And then I think the other issue is a sense of there's a sense out there. There's a mistrust of the medical establishment, and Mary's actually going to address this in much greater length in her slides. But I think that one of the ways that this is a big myth, and this is something that we've talked about at length, is that people worry that people won't participate because they mistrust the medical establishment, but that's a very simplistic way of looking at it. And the medical establishment doesn't always trust all of their patients. So Mary will expand on this for us and tell us a little bit more about this subject. And then the other myth is that it's a last resort, and it's only for patients who have no other treatment options. And once again, there are many, many, many different trials. There are trials for which this is the last thing that somebody tries. There are trials that are much earlier on in your cancer treatment trajectory, and there are trials that are for preventing cancer, and trials that aren't biomedical at all. So on your next slide, you see coming soon, which is always exciting, coming soon, the cancer support community has created a multifaceted education program called Frankly Speaking About Cancer Clinical Trials. And there will be publications, there'll be videos, there'll be radio shows, there will be a patient summit, there'll be things on our website, and there's currently a clinical trial section on our website. There's a link to it in the slides later on in this presentation. But one of the reasons that we undertook this very large project is that when we surveyed through our Cancer Experience Registry, which I'll talk to you about a little bit later, we found that these myths and the myths really held, and that we weren't moving the needle and addressing the barriers to people's participation in clinical trials. So this is launching. This program is launching as we speak, and it will be something that I hope you'll follow throughout the course of this year and beyond. So it's my great pleasure to turn over the presentation to my long-time friend and fellow advocate and colleague, Mary Jackson Scroggins. Mary and I have known each other since 1997 when she wrote a piece for a magazine that I had done at that point. And Mary has written a tremendous amount about living with cancer. She's written a tremendous amount about health equity and disparities. She has been a leader in both grassroots advocacy and really working on the ground with people, as well as high-level public policy advocacy through the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Defense and other national organizations. Mary has also served, when you see the list of many of the potential options for you, I think Mary's pretty much done every single one of those things on that list. So it is our great pleasure and privilege to have one of the great experts of clinical trials and clinical trials advocacy join us as our keynote speaker today. And Mary, just tell me next, and I'll move your slides.
Next. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much. I first thank CSC for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I think it's so important to let advocates and survivors and family members and everyone, the general public, know about research and research advocacy. It's one of my favorite things to talk about and actually to do. So, given what we have talked about already, what Gwen shared about clinical trials and what you already know about the enterprise, why would anybody want to become a research advocate? One of the things to remember, and we'll get to that later too, is that it's real work. It's not just a title. There are many, many kinds of advocacy. There's educational advocacy and support advocacy and fundraising and so on. And research advocacy is very specific. And why might you want to do it? One of the primary reasons is because it actually strengthens the whole process itself. It gives power to the process. It makes it more robust and more real world. It literally changes the way that researchers look at patients and think about the things that we need. And if they don't remember, we remind them because we're present. It keeps us at the center of all thinking, and that is absolutely important. And for many researchers or for many people, they know that know of patients or survivors, and they've worked with them in the clinic. But to have you face-to-face right there in the room makes a tremendous difference. And this idea of giving voice, one of the things that we have to remember as patient advocates, whether we are research advocates or education advocates or whatever kind of advocacy we do, we represent the collective. So it's not about giving voice just to ourselves. And there are many, many, many patient advocate voices. There isn't simply one, so we need a variety of people who are out there giving voice to all of us. We ask questions that are really specific to our experience with cancer, to our lived lives, the way that we live, what we've seen, how were we affected, what were the side effects that we had from various drugs, and so on. How did we manage in terms of coping skills and so on? So the quality of life issues, which are extremely important and sometimes get left off the table. Advocates or their research advocates always bring those kinds of issues up, particularly when they have to do with quality of life and some of the accrual issues and other things we'll say. We create a sense of urgency just by being at the table. The fact that I am sitting at the table and you will be sitting at the table makes this whole piece seem more important and more urgent. It becomes very clear that we don't have a lot of time to waste. And you will find that you'll form relationships that are just respectful and mutually beneficial that will last for many years. Some of the researchers that I met probably at the first meeting I ever went to, I'm still very close to, and we call on them when we need them, and they call on us. And this isn't my experience. This is the experience of research advocates in general. And extremely importantly, and I put it last because I wanted to make sure that we think about this one, this provides hope. We are there to provide hope, both for the researchers and for all of our communities and constituents that we work with. And the result of all of this, us becoming advocates, is that we have more focus. We have research that's more focused on issues that are important to patients. And we also make sure that we have a greater likelihood that there will be some benefit. In all research, we hope for something that would be treatment changing and would improve our lives. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what research advocacy is and is not, very specific things. It's a partnership. It is not the researcher allowing us to come into the room. It is us sharing responsibilities in an authentic, real partnership. It's a natural alliance because we'll come with certain skills and the researchers will come with certain skills. We have sort of different expertise, but our goals are very similar. It's important for us to realize we don't have to be medical professionals. We don't have to know everything about cancer or the research enterprise because we come with some skills that nobody else in the room will have. It is extremely necessary for the kind of research that will make a difference in all of our lives. It's not easy, and I think I want to dwell on this for just a second. It's not for those people who give up easily, who are discouraged easily. It is hard work. It is time-intensive. You have to consider the other things that you have in your life and your ability to handle. Sometimes, for instance, you might get 5 or 6 applications that are hundreds of pages long that you have to review in sometimes a very short period of time, and you want to give them the attention that they deserve, so it isn't easy. It's not a short-term project. When you decide to be a research advocate, you decide that you're going to go into it for the long haul, which means ongoing training, some other things that we'll talk about in just a minute. And there are many costs. Some of them are personal, financial, the cost of your time and your personal life and some other things. So it's not a free enterprise. Next, please. It requires certainly a pool of dedicated volunteers. And when I say volunteers, I don't mean necessarily people who are uncompensated, but I mean people who want to do this, who do this thing voluntarily because they feel that it's important. In fact, there may be some compensation of some kind for some of the kinds of work that you will do, and some will not. You won't have compensation for it, but you have to be dedicated to this. The whole system has to support you as an advocate. It is required that there be a system, a network of people, and the enterprise itself. At one point, you didn't see advocates sitting at the table with researchers who were reviewing protocols and so on. You do now, and the system is beginning to become stronger and stronger and more supportive of having us at the table. We have a place because there is a reason for us to be there. It's evolving. It gets better and better all the time. We form relationships, again, that are really strong and accepting. And Gwen, who's on the phone now, I remember, and I hope I'm not saying something I shouldn't say, but I was at her wedding, and one of the parts of her vow was to assume good intentions. And I think as advocates, research advocates sitting at the table, sometimes people will say things that we might be offended by or that we think, oh, my God, they can't really believe that. assume good intentions. These researchers are here for a reason. They could be doing something else. Ongoing training, that's another thing. We have to be trained all the time, and it's not just the advocates, it's the researchers, and we have an obligation to train the public, and that commitment thing is just essential. Let's move on, please. Okay, how do you prepare to be an advocate? There are a zillion ways that you can prepare, but one of the ways that you can begin to prepare, you're preparing when you participate in your own care or the care of anyone else. That you, as someone who is interested in research and interested in cancer, just research everything. Become educated, but understand that you are still an educated consumer, an advocate. You're not a scientist. Informal and formal education. Take advantage of everything that you can find. This is, again, a long-term commitment that you're making. Let's move on. So you'll find all kinds of training. Learn how to speak with scientists and researchers on their own terms. It doesn't mean that you will have the full understanding of IP versus IV therapy, or that you will know exactly what the PFS is, but you'll have some understanding of it. So you learn the language. Creating and seeking opportunities for learning. If there aren't any opportunities in your community, you can create them. Engage in other activities. Engage in activities within the advocacy community and in your community in general. You don't have to necessarily belong to an organization that has to do with cancer, but you want to belong to organizations that have to do with the well-being of your community, and you might create that group that has to do with cancer. If there's not something there, you can create it. In the Washington, D.C. area, for instance, there's an arts group that is very, very active in terms of health in general, and has taken up the cause of, particularly of gynecologic cancers, because of one of their members being diagnosed. Please move on. And just the networking. Everywhere you go and all the time you're networking. My children accuse me of advertising, and I've heard other research and other advocates say the same. So you're out there trying to get information and trying to engage people and trying to let them know that we're here and that we're available and that we're trained and prepared and we need to be at the table. An extremely important thing is to find and then to work with a mentor. If somebody doesn't find you and want to mentor you, you find them and then say, here I am. These are the skill sets I have. This is what I don't have. This is what I want. Sit beside someone. If you're at a meeting and it has to do with research and you really don't, you think that there are things you're not going to understand, or you've sat next to someone before and they've been really helpful answering questions, when you see them, sit beside them again. People love to mentor people who mean to do good and who are consistent and want further preparation. So do that. Let's move on, please. Okay. And this is my first and one of the most important rules, I think, of participation in research. It's come prepared. Next, please. Or stay home. It is far more harmful to come unprepared than not to be at the table at all. When you come unprepared, you actually do harm to all of us. You devalue what we do, you undermine our efforts, and they're lost opportunities. Everybody is not going to be a research advocate. And if you find that that's not the thing for you, do something else. Let's move on, please. Okay, human protection and research ethics. Just going to say a little bit here. Let's move on. Just so that we're all talking about the same thing, I wanted to give a few little very easy definitions. You may find something slightly different. Patient protection is just a system, a mechanism that's established to make sure that we safeguard the health and the rights of research advocates and to make sure that they aren't put to undue risk. And the ethics is simply the application of that. Let's move on, of the rules. So the history of research ethics, some of these sort of infamous events you will have heard of and some might not be familiar to you. You can Google all of them and get more information, but I thought I'd just list this here so you have some idea of what some of the challenges have been in terms of research ethics and patient protection. And I'll talk about one of these a little bit later. But let me say something about Henry Beecher's article. It's here not because it was an infamous event, but because it's focused on it. It really was groundbreaking in terms of talking about unethical medical research. Let's move on, please. Next. And just three of the codes that are really important to research ethics. And the first, the Nuremberg you've probably heard of, and focus there on, and each of them focuses on something very different. And when you get an opportunity, please look these up and you'll have more in-depth information. But here it talks about just the need for informed consent. There was a point when people did not have informed consent, meaning they didn't really know what they were getting into. They didn't sign on to things. the value to society, is it valuable to society, and levels of risk that are not allowable, that are not acceptable. We cannot put participants at risk that is not in keeping with what the potential benefit might be, and that's what unacceptable risk means. A declaration of Helsinki. Again, we go to written protocols. It's not just in someone's head, and someone reviewing it, such as you would be doing as a research advocate who has nothing to do with the research itself. And the Belmont Report is one that I think all of us probably should read and read more than once because there's so much covered there. But two of the really important pieces are about justice, what is considered fair and what is considered correct, and then fair subject selection. And that remains an issue today, this fair subject selection. We'll talk about that in a minute. But some of the criteria, which is none of them are listed here, but criteria for ethical research, there are 7 or 8 things that are generally considered really important, and they're covered in these kinds of codes. And there are things such as social value, scientific validity, the selection piece, the balance between risk and benefits, independent review, and respect for informed consent and respect for enrolled applicants, enrolled. And let me say something about this word subject. I put quotes around subject because it's the language that's used in these codes, and it's used in a lot of the language is also used in a lot of protocols and so on in clinical trials. But let's try to move towards patients or participants rather than subject. Let's move on, please. And just because we're talking about patient selection and fair selection, there's certain barriers to clinical trial participation, and these are some of these you probably will have heard, and we'll talk about one specific incident in a minute, which is the history and just the understanding of what a trial is. Many people really don't have any clear understanding of what a trial is because no one has done that. So we need some public education around clinical trials, and people need to be educated. As a research advocate, you can help to educate the public about clinical trials before they have a need for the trial. And it's important to understand trials before you need them. Actually, that's the best time to learn. The lack of trust in the medical system is one of the factors, one of the barriers. Just awareness, knowing that there are trials available. There's some unevenness and unequal recruitment and treatment. And a number of years ago, Gwen and I wrote an article together actually that had to do with physician bias and how it affects the accrual and care in terms of getting into trials and treatment as well. This whole idea of how patients and physicians communicate. There's a skill to communication, and we need to both educate patients and we need to educate physicians. We often think about patients needing the education, but it's a two-way communication. It's a whole access issue. How do we make sure that people can, even if they are told about trials, that they're not logistical impediments? The timing might be wrong, the distance, whether they can afford to get to the trial, and so on. And this whole fear factor, the idea of being a guinea pig and the placebo and so on. Let's move on, please. And let's say something about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, because that's one of the sort of atrocities that people seem to know more about, and they make an assumption. And the myth is that African Americans and some other people of color and some other underserved populations do not participate in clinical trials specifically because of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. The truth is many people have heard of it, don't really know what it is, and that is not the reason that people don't participate. It is a factor. And so the myth is that it is the overarching major, sort of elephant in the room kind of thing. And the reality is, in fact, that it is a factor, but it is not the thing that keeps people out of trials. And just so you know what it is, the next time you hear someone talk about it, it was a 40-year study of syphilis. There were 399 African-American men, mostly uneducated, who had late-stage syphilis. The most egregious, absolutely the most egregious part of this experiment was the fact that after there were treatments, they were deliberately withheld and prevented. And much data was taken from autopsy. There was an apology to the few living survivors, the few survivors in 1997. And again, there's a legacy from this and other things, but it is simply a factor, not the factor. Let's move on, please. Another myth, recruitment and enrollment. You often hear that, that underserved populations don't participate in clinical trials. They're asked, and we say no, that they simply won't do it. They because of the distrust, because of Tuskegee, because for that whatever reason. That simply has not borne out to be the truth. There was a compilation of results of, I think there were 20 healthcare studies that Wendler et al. Published in 2006. There were 70,000 patients involved. And all of these studies that were a part of this compilation had data that related to consent rates by race. And what Wendler et al. Found out, and what the paper suggests, is that Hispanic and Black patients are not less likely to participate when they're offered trials. In fact, the finding was that they're slightly more likely to say yes. But this statement is just really telling, and so I'm going to read it. I know you have it in front of you, but I think it is just sort of profound. Although we found only small differences in consent rates by race and ethnicity, we did find substantial differences by race and ethnicity in the number of individuals invited to participate. So those people that we thought wouldn't say yes were actually the uninvited. We can't let anyone be uninvited. Let's move on, please. And there's an NIH policy that directly relates to this, and it has to do with human participants. Applications or grants that involve humans are required to include all populations, and what we have called here minority populations or underserved populations, and both genders. And the reason, a major reason for this, aside from justice and fairness, is that the findings can then benefit all people at risk for the disease. So again, as research advocates, we have the opportunity to look at accrual and to look at who's being asked and so on. This is one of the things that we can really make a difference in, and see who's being invited and make sure that everyone gets an invitation. Let's move on, please. Just a little bit about institutional review boards. You probably hear IRBs, and often people don't know what IRB means. The only purpose, the sole purpose for the IRBs, they're sort of guardians of patient protection. Their purpose is to ensure patient safety and ethical research. And they're required of all research that involves humans. The work starts at the study inception, so it's from the beginning of the study that you have an IRB that's monitoring and watching and evaluating things. They're totally independent. They're supposed to be unbiased. And they monitor, so it's at the beginning and throughout the conduct of the research. And if anyone seems to have a conflict of interest of any kind, they're recused from the board so that there won't be that kind of bias. They conduct a form of sort of risk-benefit analysis to make sure that the research is, again, the benefits and the risk are in balance. And they have to have a community representative. And we can read community representative generally to mean a patient advocate or someone from the community or someone who has some connection, direct connection to the kind of IRB that they're covering, the subject matter that they're covering. And there's something called a central IRB, and sometimes people have heard of it. You may not have heard of it. But it was designed just to reduce all of the burden, the administrative burden to the local IRBs and investigators, but maintaining the same quality of protection for any trial that has NCI-sponsored enrollment or trial, any NCI-sponsored trial, rather. Let's move on, please. I was going to say a little about informed consent. I know all of you have probably heard of informed consent before, but one of the things I want to emphasize just at the beginning here, that informed consent has two parts. And the first of it is that there has to be a document of some kind. I'm going to talk about the document more than about the process, not because the document is more important, but that's one of the things that you will be reviewing if you become a research advocate. The process is every bit as more important, and perhaps more important than the document itself, because the document means nothing if we don't make sure that there's a process that allows people to make sure they understand all of the words, that they understand what's going to happen to them, that they understand that it's voluntary and that they don't have to sign and so on, and that they're given time to think about these things, and that they have something in hand that they can take with them and so on. Anyway, there are 8 parts that you have to have in informed consent. The introduction, which is basically where you're inviting people to participate, and it is an invitation. It is not a requirement. The statement that the purpose statement, why is this being done? For what reason am I in the study? Why am I studying IP, intraperitoneal therapy versus IV, intravenous therapy? What's the difference? What are these things? And you have to define all the terms. Description of the study, it will be enhanced by a visual protocol, meaning there should be a schema, there should be something, a chart, there should be a graph or something that people can read very easily and understand. because the informed consent is for the prospective participant. You want to say approximately how many people are in the study and what kind of study is, what phase of a study is it. You have to be very clear about the risk. If I decide that I want to be in a study or you are thinking about being in a study, you need to know what the risks are. And as research advocates, we can look at these informed consent forms and documents and say, okay, we didn't tell them what the risk is. And one of the risks sometimes is death. And often we have to say, you forgot to put that in there. Description of benefits. If there are any benefits, say that there are. Often there is not a direct benefit to the individual, and you have to say that. And then disclosure of other alternatives. For instance, if there is a treatment available for the illness that's being studied, then in fact, or at the stage, you need to say what those options are. And you have to make it clear that, in fact, if the potential participant decides not to participate, since it is voluntary, that they won't lose any rights and that they won't be treated any differently. Let's move on, please. And here are just a couple of other things to think about in terms of informed consent. There has to be a confidentiality statement. We have to make sure that we handle information in a manner that is acceptable and that information won't get out to the public and won't do harm to the individuals who have volunteered. Cost-related information. One of the things that people often don't realize is that, for instance, if you're injured on a study, inadvertently certainly, but if you receive injury on a study, you will be treated. You'll have several numbers that you can call. You'll be treated at the center where you're getting your trial or where the trial is taking place, or in your community. But in fact, you or your insurance will generally have to pay for any injury that results from trial participation. You need to know how to terminate the trial, how you can terminate. You can always certainly withdraw. That's just like you volunteer to be in it, you can withdraw voluntarily. However, sometimes because of the drugs that you might be taking or the intervention, you need to gradually do certain things. So you always, so there's information on that. Handling of significant findings. If we find something out that we didn't know at the beginning of this process, what happens with it? Will you find out as a participant? Will someone let you know that, for instance, we've had some major breakthrough on the study, or that we found something out that might influence your care in general? Any major finding, any significant findings, how will that be handled? And there should be contact information so that any time you have a question, you can always ask. And one of the bits of contact that you should have there, you should have contact information on how you can actually call the IRB. So I think that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. That was terrific, and a terrific overview. And we'll dive a little bit into ways to become involved, and I may also call on Mary a little bit to fill in some of these some areas, because as I mentioned when I was introducing her, Mary has been involved in, I think, just about every single thing on this. So there are a number of ways to become involved, and there are ways that are require significant commitment. There are ways that are on a public policy area. There are also ways to participate as a participant in certain kinds of studies. So we wanted to give you a sense of some of the different ways to become involved. So the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and then the National Cancer Institute has a number of different ways of being involved, and there's actually there'll be a link at the end, but there's a good publication on their advocacy website that shows you different ways to become involved. So there is a council, there is an advisory group to the NCI director, and it's currently called the NCI Directors Council of Research Advocates. It used to be called the NCI Directors Consumers Liaison Group, and I chaired that committee, and Mary had been on that committee long before I was. But it was a group of people representing patient voices who advised the NCI director and directors. There's also the National Clinical Trials Network. Many clinical trials are done through the NCI and also through NCI-designated cancer centers. The Food and Drug Administration has many different ways for people to participate, from ongoing participation on drug advisory committees to patient participation in hearings and other open meetings. So just to give you a little background on the NIH and the NCI, they are the largest publicly funded institutions focused on cancer research, prevention, and treatment. It is a phenomenal place. It is a place that's very, very much worth visiting with the clinical center and the entire NIH campus in Bethesda, Maryland. The NIH and the NCI support numerous clinical trials related to cancer research, and they are all focused, and I'm not sure if I can say all, but I would say the vast majority are biomedical trials, and they're focused on treatment. They're treatment trials, but there is also a prevention network within the NCI, and there is there's a very active prevention area as well, both primary, meaning preventing the first cancer, and secondary, meaning preventing a cancer from coming back. And the NCI Center for Cancer Research provides resources for cancer patients interested in participating in clinical trials, as well as their advisory council. And again, there is a link that you'll see at the end of these slides to the NCI's website, and also particularly to the advocacy section on the website. The NCI also has an intramural research division, the NIH, and they have a clinical center. And in the clinical center, which is something that is not widely known, if people are eligible for a clinical trial, all of your treatment is free. It's free because it is, and it's not just cancer, it's all different diseases. But this is part of what taxpayer money does, is it runs the NIH Clinical Center, which does some of the leading research in the world on many diseases. The Directors Council of Research Advocates, they advise the NCI, the director of the NCI, on challenges facing research and the Institute more broadly. And the director of the NCI has a number of councils, and the Research Advocates Council is in the same configuration as the Scientific Advisory Board and other councils. So it's a very interesting and very important role, and they are always looking for new participants in that council. There is more information on their website if you're interested in becoming and working on this level.
So, Gwen, I'm going to ask you to pause for a second, because
Yes.
we just got a really good question from one of our participants, wondering what is the NCI?
Yes.
What does the NCI stand for? What I can say is that it's essentially part of the National Institutes of Health, which is a government agency, and the NCI, the National Cancer Institute's sole goal is to look at different types of research, look at different ways of treatment, and different forms of hopefully someday curing cancer. I think that's the ultimate goal of what the NCI does, and it formed out of a law that passed in the early 1970s called the National Cancer Act. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but
no, I think the other thing is to just remind everybody it's the largest funder of cancer research in the country, and so many of the treatments that end up coming to the bedside the initial research starts at the NCI, and with either NCI scientists at the NIH or with people who are affiliated in other cancer centers. So just about everything that we've been treated with, and our families and our loved ones have been treated with, started as a research project at the NCI. So really, without the NCI, we would not be where we are today in terms of delivering effective treatments to patients. So I hope that answers the question. If it doesn't, please write something in there in the question box. And I think it's a really so I think actually that's a really good question. And I think one of the things that some of us advocates and people who are more part of the research enterprise forget is that we talk in acronyms. Every different profession has their own acronyms. And we don't remember that not everybody understands everything that we say. And so I think one of the roles, actually, of research advocates and advocates in these situations is to question people and make sure that the scientists are communicating and the healthcare professionals are communicating in a way that's meaningful to patients. And in turn, it's the scientists will ask the research advocates to help them understand things that patients and their families are communicating. So we just assume, we often make too many assumptions about each other and too many assumptions about people's level of knowledge. So one of the most important things to do as an advocate is to ask questions and to continually ask questions. Now, there are things that you clearly should be aware of before you go in, and as Mary talked about being prepared, there's a lot of background material that you can prepare. There also are workshops and there are trainings, and there are a lot of things that help you understand how to become a research advocate. But one of the things that's very, very important is to ask questions, and to ask the questions in such a way that we all focus on the benefits to the patients. So if you're interested in serving on the council or becoming an advocate for the NCI, because there are different ways of becoming an advocate, here's the information to reach out to the Office of Advocacy Relations. They take applications every year, because every year some people's term is up and new people need to come in. And they have a very good website that talks about advocacy and what advocacy is in general, not just what advocacy is for the NCI. They also have a group called a group of advocates that they have in a database that people can call on for different things, whether it's a one-off project like answering, being part of a looking at materials or being part of a focus group, or whether it's a long-term commitment, or whether it's doing a speaking engagement. So there are multiple ways of being involved. So I think the National Cancer Institute is a very, very good place to start. Then the FDA is also more and more integrating advocates and patient voices into what they do. So there has always been an advisory committee that has patients and lay people on it. But the FDA has more and more been doing meetings around different diseases to hear from the public, to hear from people who are impacted by those diseases. So it is a great way of being involved. There are hearings for every time that they're considering a drug approval, and then there are also public meetings where they're talking about different issues. And again, there should be a link to the FDA site at the end of these slides, and if there isn't, we'll make sure that it's on the website. So then there's some other ways to be involved. Drug or device manufacturers, many of them involve advocates as advisors, sometimes with a board that meets and gives them some advice. Sometimes it's a longer commitment. And you can often assist with the design of the clinical trial itself along with the manufacturer. They also often seek feedback on informed consent, and it's very, very important that we make our voices heard through submitting feedback. And I think that, I think it's one of the challenges for all of us is to find ways of making comments and giving feedback. There was an article a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times by the woman who wrote the book on Henrietta Lacks, because there had been a public comment period open for the Mary, help me. It was the new looking at the pardon me. The common rule, and
yes.
She was talking about how there were no public comments on it. But how do you even know to make a public comment if you don't know that if it isn't accessible to you? So one of the things that we will do on our website is keep you up to date on places where you can make public comments and where public comments are solicited. And you can really make an impact by doing this. I think that you should not underestimate what that means and how people think about that.
And I'll just add that that's another benefit of joining the Grassroots Network, which I'm going to be also making a plug for at the end of the presentation here tonight. If you join as a member, we'll make sure to keep you updated on when there is an open public comment period to comment on whether it's the common rule or some other new rule or government regulation that whether it's NCI or FDA is putting out. So.
Great. And then there's also institutional review boards, which Mary mentioned earlier, and there are every community and every community hospital that is involved in research has an institutional review board. So you can participate in a local community. You can also look at participating in the central IRB, which is a little different than the smaller IRBs, but it is a way to serve as a representative on the board and provide both the lay and the patient and the community perspectives. And the more that we are at the table, the more that our voices are heard, the more that we can ensure that the research that's done and that the treatments that are developed are things that are really meaningful to patients. So I have two real-world examples, and the two real-world examples actually are not treatment trials. They are two very different research projects. We at the Cancer Support Community in 2013 launched the Cancer Experience Registry. And we created it to identify and advance the understanding of the emotional and social needs of people living with cancer and their caregivers. It was designed based on a pilot project with women with breast cancer for people with all different diagnoses of cancer. And the participants helped inform how we developed this Cancer Experience Registry. So, for example, our first registry was called the Cancer Survivor Registry, and we got a lot of feedback that people that was not a term that resonated with them, that they really wanted to talk about experience. So what we're really focusing on is capturing experience. So it's a unique online community, and it brings people impacted by cancer together to make their voices heard. We also just launched a cancer caregiver experience registry, and people can answer questions, share experiences, learn from, and help others. We now have nearly 9,000 participants, patients and caregivers, and the registry is open to any individual impacted by cancer at any stage of their experience. And a lot of what we've done and a lot of what's informed both our program development and our policy work are things that we've learned from the Cancer Experience Registry. So as I said earlier when we started, one of the things that really inspired us to do a very large clinical trials awareness and advocacy program was through the things that we learned from the Cancer Experience Registry. We've learned a lot about the financial impact of cancer and what that means in terms of people, in terms of a medical impact and also in terms of societal impact. We've learned about isolation. We've learned about community. We've learned about many, many different things. And on our website is last year's. This year's will be ready in the next couple of months. Last year's report on our findings from the Cancer Experience Registry called Elevating the Patient Voice. And if you look at that, you will see there's a PDF version there. You will see the kinds of things that we learned and what you have told us and what we've learned from you. So I would urge you to participate in it. Like any other research project, it's completely voluntary. You go in and you sign up. We have an IRB waiver on it. We submit it to the IRB, but it is a research project and a community. So it's a wonderful hybrid of those two things. So you fill out a simple registration form and then a detailed questionnaire, and and people do it on an ongoing basis. Along with we have monthly newsletters. We ask questions. We use your answers to your questions to inform the programs that we're doing. To look at the new questions we're going to ask registry participants. And this is not just for the cancer support community. This is not just to drive our programs, but this is also to affect change for everybody impacted by cancer. And so we have over 150 advisors on our registry and on our different specialty registries who represent all stakeholders in the cancer community, including patients, of course, caregivers, and many of our advocacy and patient group partners. So another way to join a clinical trial is to look at an observational clinical study. So a lot of what people think about when they think about clinical trials is they think about treatment and interventional trials. So they think about something being done to you. But ACS, with the American Cancer Society, funds cancer prevention research to understand how to prevent all cancer types. And so they have a great study called the Cancer Prevention Study 3, and their ultimate goal is to enroll 300,000 adults from various racial ethnic backgrounds from across the U.S. And I would very much encourage you, if you're interested in an observational study, to consider joining this as well, because it'll study lifestyle, behavioral, environmental, genetic factors that may increase your risk or prevent cancer. So I think that this is, the more we learn about what we can individually do, and there is not, and this is not to say that we can prevent our own cancers. I will say, as a cancer survivor, one of the most upsetting questions that I would get was, and what do you think you did to get your cancer? But there are things that we can do in terms of lifestyle changes that improve our overall health and reduce our risk of many, many, many different diseases. So these kinds of observational studies really give us a lot of information in terms of how we can look at lifestyle factors and change. So here are some additional opportunities to be involved, and this is a long list, but this just shows you the very great range of how to be involved. There are advocacy organizations and support groups, and Rob's going to talk about our grassroots advocacy, and there are support groups, and through our affiliates, through multiple different organizations, online, telephone support groups, and that's a way to be involved. There are concept and protocol development groups, and that generally is for people who have been doing research advocacy for a while and are really looking at somewhat more sophisticated ways of joining. But there are also times when people are just asked questions. What is it? If there's a fourth biopsy, what is that going to mean to accrual to a trial as opposed to the standard of care, which is 2? So there are different ways to be involved in concept and protocol development. There are scientific review panels. So many organizations where they give out funds for clinical research, the best practices now are to have lay reviewers on scientific review panels, and I've participated on a number of them, and Mary has participated on a number of them. And that is thanks to the work of advocates that is now considered best practice. There is another thing that comes out of the NIH, SPORE, Specialized Programs of Research Excellence, which is a multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary activity with people who have multiple specialties. There are NCI steering committees, task force panels, and boards. And again, look at the NCI website to see different ways that you can be involved. There are also places that you could just go. The NCI Council of Research Advocates, all of those meetings are open to the public. So if you're interested, if you're in the D.C. area and you're interested, you can go to the meeting. If you're not in the D.C. area, all of those meetings are webcast. So there are governmental consumer groups. There's Department of, this is going in such an odd way. Department of Defense research programs, Mary's been involved in those. The Department of Defense gives a tremendous amount of money out for research. There are clinical trials as study participants and as research team members. And I just like to reiterate again, because I think we can't say this enough, is that there are multiple different kinds of clinical trials, from treatment trials to observational trials to research studies like our Cancer Experience Registry, where we're collecting experience and so the patient reports it, to prevention trials. And then there are other federal boards and panels. There are health-centered organizations that are always looking for patient voices. They're always looking for input. There are research and health-focused organizations that are also always looking for patient voices, and community-based organizations. And I think, as Mary mentioned earlier on, an arts organization in her community is very, very active in health issues. And so don't think just because an organization is in one, you think it's in one discipline, that they're not interested in other things that impact the community that they are serving. There is also Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
And I think at this point, I'm going to remind you to type your questions and answers in the Q&A field. Would you like to ask a couple questions?
Yeah, actually.
Should I turn it over the Capitol Hill? Okay.
Well, yeah, and so just first off, Gwen, to add to ways to get involved on the Hill, one of the, you've been talking about clinical trials and all of the things that go into a clinical trial, but what comes first is the actual funding. And this is all within the National Institutes of Health, and which is funded by Congress annually through annual appropriations. And really, for the last 10 years, funding for NIH has really lagged behind compared to a lot of other government agencies. And so one of the best ways that you can get involved in the Hill is by contacting your legislator and urging them to continue to increase funding for NIH and for clinical trials. And if you go to the Grassroots Network, cscadvocate.org, right now, you can actually write your legislator and ask them to continue to increase funding to NIH. So that's really one great way to get involved right away by urging your member of Congress to increase funding for NIH and funding for clinical trials. So we've gotten a couple of really good questions that I think that we should we're kind of here at this pause point to ask a couple of questions, and I think that I'm going to ask both Gwen and Mary to answer a couple of questions for us. First off, one of our participants has asked two questions, logistical questions about clinical trials. First of all, how are participants compensated? And then also, do clinical trials take place in every state? Are they available in all 50 states across the country? Gwen, I don't know if you want to take a stab at answering that, or Mary, if either of you want to take it.
So for biomedical trials, and Mary, correct me if I'm making a complete oversimplification, but for biomedical trials, participants are not compensated. If you participate in a behavioral trial, or if you participate in a focus group, there are people are often compensated with gift cards or something, some small things. But it is the compensation aspect of it is a very it's a very sticky issue, because it is also goes to ethics and undue influence. And Mary, is there anything you want to add, or do you think that's? Oh no. Okay, Mary's disconnected. So if she has anything to add, but there's a very significant prescription against undue influence, and money can absolutely be undue influence in terms of participating in research. Clinical trials do take place in every state, but that does not mean that every clinical trial takes place in every state. And so one of the things when you look at, I would urge you to look at what the materials on our website. It'll talk to you a little. We talk a little bit about that, and we talk about the difference. So the clinical trial that may be offered in the center where you're receiving treatment may not be the clinical trial may not be a clinical trial that's relevant to your particular disease. So you often have to look beyond just the place where you are being treated if you want to look at clinical trials. And there are some imperfect clinical trials matching services, but those are people are doing more and more work on trying to match people up with clinical trials.
Great. So while we're waiting for Mary to get back on, I think we'll just kind of run through the rest of the slides.
I think I'm back on.
Oh, Mary.
Oh, great.
So Mary,
I have no idea what happened.
Okay.
I just want to.
Did you want to add to what I just said about undue influence or compensation?
I do, just a little bit. Just a little. Generally speaking, you will not be compensated. The most frequent pattern is that you would not be compensated for biomedical research. However, we are seeing that and sitting on a CIRB, we are seeing that there is some compensation occasionally, because there are costs that they think it's fair to cover, and it would be a barrier not to cover. However, the issue of coercion and the ethical issue is one that really causes a lot of discussion when there is any compensation, and it is generally very minor. Whatever you're receiving, it will not generally is not enough to make anyone really want to be on the trial, except we're finding that when you're talking about economically disadvantaged populations, that sometimes there is a question of coercion. So generally, no, there will not be payment. And there will not be payment, I think, to remember if there is injury. And I think that's a really important thing because people forget that if there is injury on trial, you will have to make sure that your insurance will cover that injury, the cost of that injury. You will be cared for, but you will have to pay for it.
But Mary, in some ways, I would think that this issue is more, in terms of what we say compensation, is really more reimbursement of out-of-pocket expenses.
It is to some extent. I know that just recently reviewed a protocol, an application, and there was payment for several, I think their CAT scans, or there was some procedure that normally would not be a part of care. And because they took so much out of the person to do it and took extra time and essentially changed their lives, and they had to do some things they wouldn't ordinarily have to do, there was compensation. And by the time it was over, the compensation, since I'm not talking about the trial, I can say the amount. The full amount was about $300, which seems like a very small amount, but it depends on the population that you're talking to. So there is still that issue of coercion, but if you don't provide, the other side of that is if you don't provide compensation in some ways, you don't provide some payment, there are populations that cannot participate. They can't get there. There's travel and so on, those kinds of things.
All right. Great.
I wanted to say something that isn't a question if you don't have another question.
Oh, please.
Oh, yeah.
And Gwen mentioned several times about the whole idea of speaking up and communicating and how important it is that our voices are heard and so on. And one of the things that I just want to say really, really quickly is that, I make a list of sort of communications things that we have to think about if we are research advocates. And one of the things that is really important is to just be present and be aware that you don't have to say anything, only speak when you have something to say and to really contribute, that don't feel compelled to speak. But the flip side of that is never be afraid to speak. So be comfortable in what you're doing because you're so important and your voice is so important in terms of being there. And never start a comment with, "I am not a scientist, but." That's it.
Yes, never "I am, but." I am not,
yes.
but. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes. So I'm going to run sort of quickly through some of our resources because these will be available on the website, and then I will turn it back over to Rob, who can talk about our grassroots advocacy network. So clinicaltrials.gov, which has been put together by the National Institutes of Health. It's run by the National Library of Medicine at the NIH. It's the largest clinical trials database. It is not the easiest database to navigate. So a lot of people look at how they can use this and what is the best way to use this, but it is a place to start. These are some key websites to start your research, cancer.gov. It does have a tool to help you search for clinical trials. And then, as I mentioned before, the Office of Advocacy Relations of the National Cancer Institute, this is the link to their website. And they are very open to talking with people. And you can just give them a call and say, "I want to get involved in research," and they will talk to you. And then just sort of generally, the NIH.gov has basic information about clinical trials and things to think about when you're deciding to take part. FDA, as I mentioned before, the Food and Drug Administration has ongoing standing committees, public meetings, and public hearings. And this will give you an idea of some of the things that are available through the FDA. And almost all of these places have newsletters and e-newsletters that you can sign up for. So there is an external affairs department at FDA, which also looks at public health and regulatory activities. And there's also specific information about clinical trials and what patients need to know. And that is a very good resource. Our resources, We have a newly launched website, cancersupportcommunity.org, which is the same website address as we had before. But one of the sections on the website in Learn About Cancer is in the topics are what are clinical trials, and we're putting in more and more information there every day. So it's a great place to start your research. We also, the Cancer Experience Registry is cancerexperienceregistry.org. I really encourage anybody who isn't part of that to please join and encourage others to join. It's a great way to participate. It's a great way to learn, and it's a great way to see what others are thinking, because there's an automatic. Every time when you answer the questions, you can see how others like you answered the same question. And then there's the CITI program, which is a collaborative institutional training initiative, and it covers key regulatory and ethical areas. And so there's the link for that. It's a terrific resource as well. So this is the contact information for Mary and for myself. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to email. And now I'm going to turn it over to Rob to talk about how to take action on the legislative advocacy side.
Great. Thanks, Gwen. And thank you, Gwen and Mary, both so much for your presentations this evening. I thought you both did a great job. It was very, very educational and informative for me, really, as an advocate for patients, to just learn about clinical trials. The history I thought was particularly interesting too. The history, Mary, that you shared, I thought was really, really great. So this slide is my contact information, and also included here is the website address to the Grassroots Network. So I invite all of you to visit the website right now, cscadvocate.org. And if you go to the website, you can click the Join Now button in the upper right-hand corner, and you can put in all your contact information, including email address, and then you'll be officially signed up as a member of the network. And we have been sending and will continue to be sending out regular updates. There's a lot going on right now with the Vice President's recent moonshot announcement. So much going on right now with 21st Century Cures legislation in Congress. We're going to be continuing to send out information and urging you to take action on a whole lot of different issues. One really interesting question that I just got here from one of our participants is, are there ways to be an advocate in the state that you live in? Maybe get a little bit more local, whether you live in Illinois or New York or Maryland or Virginia or maybe even Montana. And the answer to that question is yes, absolutely. There are lots of things happening at the state level, whether it be issues like oral parity, step therapy, a whole range of different things at the state level that are happening. Something like oral parity, where access to different types of drugs is so vitally important. So it's going to be a really great opportunity. We highly encourage you to sign up and sign up right now. And we welcome you to do it. And we'll be continuing to update you and bring you more information. One other quick question that I'm hoping that we can ask here really quick before we end. We had a really great question from Leslie that I'm hoping that I could just ask Gwen and Mary here really quickly. She asked it towards the beginning of the webinar, and I thought it was really good, very more specific. And the question is, how many trials do not use placebos in typical double-blind trials? And I think that that's a very pinpointed question that I think would be really good for folks to learn about. So Gwen, I'm wondering if you might be able to, yeah.
So the only time in a cancer clinical trial that a placebo is ever used is when there is not a standard of care, and that is extremely rare. So if you're in a randomized trial, you will either get the standard of care, which is the best available treatment, or the experimental arm. And the standard of care, the balance is the standard of care we know what the standard, we can predict very much what the course is of the standard of care, not for individuals, but on a population level. And the experimental drug, people hypothesize is better than the standard of care, but they do not know that it's better than the standard of care. But you will not receive a placebo unless there is no standard of care. And it is, I don't know what you would say, Mary, but 98% of the time you would never receive a placebo.
And I think
treatment would not be withheld from you, I think is really, maybe that's what the question is that's underlying that. Being in a clinical trial, treatment will not be withheld from you.
I think it's, can I be heard now? I can't tell.
Please, yes, you can be.
I think I couldn't tell if I was on because I got, for some reason, got cut off before. I think the most important thing to remember in terms of whether you'll get placebo, what you'll get, and so on, is that you will always, always, always receive at least the standard of care. You will never receive less than what it would be considered standard of care. No IRB, no central IRB would allow that ever to happen. So I would not worry about that. And in terms of placebo, again, people are afraid when they hear it. But remember, if you're getting the placebo, what you would not be getting, again, you're not getting less than you would have gotten without the placebo. That's really, really important because I know it frightens people. I don't know what the numbers are in terms of how often you have placebo in trial. I do see placebo trials more than I used to for some reason. However, again, it's for something that there is no other treatment for. But you will always get at least minimal, the standard of care as a minimum, no matter what trial you're in.
Great. We're about to wrap up and close for the evening, but we have this last slide here. Advocates and researchers are natural and necessary partners in research and discovery, and I think that that's a great way to kind of sum up everything that we've talked about this evening, and to once again encourage folks to become more involved, become more of advocates, and sign up for the network. So Gwen, Mary, thank you once again so much for your presentations tonight. We really enjoyed it. And also one final quick plug, we want to make sure that we thank our sponsors for the webinar tonight, Bristol-Myers Squibb and Novartis. So thank you very much for joining, and have a great night.